So guys, we need to get into specifics a little bit. You're probably wondering, is this just going to be an overall general theme? And the answer is no. We do go into a little bit of detail. That's the purpose of taking a class, learning something that you don't already know, right? And I'm going to focus on details of the 29 CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. And we've already kind of discussed this previously in the last video. But out of the 29 CFR, you have to imagine this as a book, right? And books are made up of chapters. And inside of each of these books, or this literature reference, there's going to be individual sections that we're going to have to pay closer attention to. And 29 CFR 1910 Subpart H is what we're after. And this is sometimes people refer to as the HAZWOPER because it's a whopper, it's a doozy, right? Okay, well, the HAZWOPER, if that's how you want to refer to this as, it's okay with me, basically stands for something particular. The HAZ is the hazardous waste. So this is the hazardous, the W for the waste, O stands for operations, and the E stands for emergency, and the R stands for response. So hazardous waste operations and emergency response. That is what 29 CFR 1910 Subpart H is going to give you details on. So if we were producing waste in the laboratory, how do we remove that waste from the lab, especially if it's hazardous? What do I do with it? How do I dispose of it? If something happens to that waste, then what goes on as far as the employee safety? If something happens to the waste and let's say it's spilt into a public area, what should we do in order to make sure that those people are notified of the right way to go about living with the waste until it gets cleaned up? Now, this is going to go into another subpart as well, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but this is basically hazardous waste. How do you handle it, and what happens in an emergency? Well, we also have a 29 CFR. It's also 1910 Subpart, not H this time, but I. And the Subpart I is going to be our personal protective equipment. We've already talked about personal protective equipment, and we gave that an abbreviation of PPE. So, for example, goggles, lab coats, steel-toed shoes, closed-toed shoes, face shields, all of that would be personal protective equipment. When should I wear it? When should you not wear it? What kind of substances should you wear it around? Who's responsible in acquiring the personal protective equipment, and what role do they play? Both you and your employer both. Okay? Another 29 CFR section that we need to mention as well in the 1910 kind of chapter or subpart, if you want to think of that, Subpart Z. And that's toxic and hazardous substances. Now, notice that Subpart Z is toxic and hazard substances, right? That is not Subpart H. Subpart H focuses on the waste that's generated. This is not waste, right? These could just be toxic and hazardous substances that we're working with in the lab. It is not classified as waste yet, but these are dangerous reagents that we're handling, right? So this one is going to be broken down in a little bit more detail, okay? So we've got 1910 Subpart Z, and under Subpart Z there's a section called 1200. So 1910.1200, and this is going to be called the Hazcom. HAZCOM. HOMM. Some people leave off the extra M and some people put it on. It's just really up to you on how you want to write it. But as listed in the CFR, the extra M is present. Some people will leave it off because it just looks weird, two M's side by side, right? So what's the Hazcom? What does it do and what's its purpose? Well, the COM stands for communication. So this is notify workers if something happens, right? So if something happens or if they're going to be working with a toxic or hazardous substance, how do you notify workers in the workplace? That's the thing here, right? You have to let them know that they're working with something kind of dangerous. This also falls under the category of SDS. So the safety data sheets. So safety data sheets. These used to be called the Material Safety Data Sheets, MSDS, but they dropped the M and they just called it Safety Data Sheet. Probably a couple of years ago was when that started. And then chemical coding also goes under this section. So what are acids, what are bases, what are oxidizers, what are flammables, what are poisons? Those are the types of classifications that we have to think of, and we have to keep that in mind due to storage. Where do these chemicals get stored? All of this falls under the Hazcom. Okay, Hazcom is 1910.1200. Notify workers that they're working with something bad. Make sure that the safety data sheets are available to them and let them know where to find them, right? It's not going to do anybody any good if you don't know where they're going to be located. And then chemical coding. Where do chemicals get stored and why do they get stored in the areas that they do? Okay, so that is all Hazcom, part of 1910 Subpart Z. But if we want to hone in, because there's a lot of verbiage and a lot of different sections in that kind of chapter, we need to go to part 1200 to look for Hazcom. All right. I also want to mention that there's entire courses built around Hazcom in certain laboratories. So you can be Hazcom certified. You can take these courses. You can get certificates and you can get training on them. But Hazcom is a pretty important one that's out there. All right. So next up, we're still talking about details here, right? So we're still talking about 29 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, 1900, and it's still Subpart Z. Now, last time we talked about 1900.1200. This time we're talking about 1900.1450. This is a different area of the document, a different kind of chapter. Think of it that way, I guess. And this is going to be Occupational, OCCUP. So Occupational Exposure to Hazardous Chemicals. In laboratories. So this really, if I want to highlight one of the words that makes this different from everyone else, is the exposure category, right? So in the beginning, when we started talking about these breakdowns, we saw 1910 Subpart H focus on waste, right? Waste generated by a lab. Well, in Subpart Z, we talked about Hazcom. Notification to workers that they're working with toxic substances or hazardous chemicals. Okay, this Subpart Z .1450, this is focusing on exposure. All right, so that's how all of these are a little bit different. Okay, so what can I say about this one? This is known as the lab standard. Okay, pretty important. It handles chemicals in the lab. How should you handle them? What should you do with them? Where should you store them? What should happen if something goes wrong? This is all occupational exposure. We want to limit your exposure to these types of compounds whenever possible. And this Subpart Z .1450, it's going to tell a laboratory how to minimize that exposure to you as a worker in a lab. Now, the problem is that we call it the lab standard. This is kind of our Bible that we go by as far as lab safety is concerned. However, there are no specifics that are listed in this section. And the reason is because they want companies to kind of do their own thing. They don't want to set a list of rigid standards that everyone has to follow, because they know that there's tons of different labs that are out there, and they all work a different way. They all use different substances. They all handle their chemicals differently. So there's no one way that we can force labs to conform. So because of that, there's no specifics in the subpart. The only thing that they do is give you general run-of-the-mill statements that you have to follow, and it's up to your lab to make sure that they are in compliance with those general statements. That's what we want, right? Under this subpart, we also see what we call a Chemical Hygiene Plan. This is basically a document that all laboratories should have. And the Chemical Hygiene Plan is basically a book of paperwork, and the new employees go through this book, go through the paperwork. They kind of read. Some of them take assignments. Some of them take quizzes. Some take a training initiative as part of their hiring package. But the Chemical Hygiene Plan should be kind of integrated in that training. And this basically tells people, what do you do in case there's a spill? What do you do when you have to send waste off for disposal? Those are the types of things that we see here. When should you pull the fire alarm? When should you call the authorities? That's the Chemical Hygiene Plan. Where should things be stored? What locations should they be stored in? So chemical hygiene, think of your own hygiene. You take care of yourself every day, right? This is how we take care of chemicals and take care of the laboratory every single day. Now, on top of that, most companies, if they have a chemical hygiene plan, they have a chemical hygiene officer. And this is one person that's in charge of the chemical hygiene plan at that particular laboratory or for that particular company. So their job is to go through the paperwork, make sure it's staying up to date, make sure things are making sense. If there's any changes or modifications that have to happen, that chemical hygiene officer will do those. And that chemical hygiene officer is also responsible of training or implementing a training program for the new employees that might come through the company. Now, all of these are OSHA requirements. They are legal, right? They're in the Code of Federal Regulations. Laboratories have to follow them. We have to reference to them whenever we can. And these are certain subparts that are going to be pretty important, okay? All right, so there's a little bit about specifics. So what we'll do in the next video, I'm going to give you a break, and what we'll do in the next video is that we'll come back and maybe we'll talk another portion of the CFR and give you some more general overview before this lecture series is over.